Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the thematic session number 8, a Kairos moment, accountability to address inequality. I'm Stefano Fassina, member of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. I will make a few remarks and then I will let the co-chair, Catherine Marshall, to introduce the session. First of all, let me thank the organizer of the Interfaith Forum, Professor Roberto Melloni, Director of the Foundation for the Religious Studies, and its staff. The co-chair, Professor Catherine Marshall, also Vice President of the Interfaith Forum, and all our panelists. As you know, in reference to the title of our session, Kairos is an ancient Greek word. It does not refer to the chronological nature of time, but to its qualitative nature. And it means right, critical, or opportune time, when there is, for a short while, an opportunity to catch. Are we in a Kairos moment now? Potentially, yes. The COVID-19 has made more visible and has increased inequalities among nations and within each nation. In many ways, the conditions were and are now even more unsustainable. Against this background, we say it's time to heal. My fear is that we are missing the Kairos moment. The cultural hegemony and the policy agenda are the same of the pre-COVID era, for a world marked by more severe divergences in terms of cultural, environmental, social, and health conditions. I think our session can focus on two topics for addressing inequalities. First, access to resources, not only financial, and we will address also the financial issues, but first and foremost now on the anti-COVID-19 vaccine. The second point is the accountability for the use of the extremely constrained resources. On the first point, access to resources, the G20 health ministries last week in Rome signed a final declaration with plenty of beautiful contents, but no words and no commitment on the key point of suspending the patent rights for increasing vaccination in poor and less developed countries. Not a word. In the EU, US, and the other developed countries, governments are planning or actually implementing the third shot of vaccines. In the rest of the world, the large majority of people does not have access to the first one, and the mortality rates are still very high, even for the younger population. Should the message from the Internet Forum to the G20 meeting scheduled in Rome at the end of October include a request for a clear and credible commitment on suspension of the anti-COVID-19 vaccine patent rights? This is a question I think is very relevant and we should address. On the second point, accountability to address inequalities. Religious experiences have particular responsibilities and potential for action in the poorest and most vulnerable and fragile situation. Religious and faith traditions share teaching that speak to the core values of trust and honesty. Corrupt practices are considered shameful in light of religious and faith belief and paradigms. Accountability in many countries, especially in the countries that need it the most, can only be improved in the short term through engagement of religious and civil communities. My question is, what are the possible ways for introducing their involvement or strengthening their involvement? Could we suggest to strengthen involvement of religious and civil communities as conditionality in the many programs that usually are implemented in these countries? In conclusion, the risk of missing the Kairos moment is very high. If it is missed, societies are not going back where they were before the COVID, but they will get very, very far behind. It's time to heal, and it's time to heal now. So if we need to catch the Kairos moment, we need very bold decision. Thanks. I leave the micro to Mrs. Professor Catherine Marshall.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And great minds think remarkably alike, since I had many of the same comments. But I will start. I'm teaching a class at Georgetown University now on the topic of pandemics, starting with the COVID pandemic. And my first assignment to my students was to write a letter to their grandchildren about how they had lived the COVID crisis. Because as we reflect now on what for Americans at least is a hugely traumatic moment, the 9/11 crisis, many of us have engraved in our minds what happened 20 years ago. And the students today should have engraved in their minds something similar of a crisis that unites but also divides the entire world. And that's where this theme of the Kairos moment comes, that it is a moment of grace and opportunity. And I'm, I guess, a little bit less pessimistic, more optimistic that this moment has to come to build back fairer, greener, to shock us out of complacency. The G20, we haven't talked very much here about the G20 itself, but it was created to deal with crises. It is basically a crisis management institution, though it has taken on a much broader role in the global agenda. But the crisis in this case, much of it, even though it's not part of the sort of structure of global governance, is falling on the G20. And thus the Italian presidency now has some special responsibilities for patent issues, for dealing with the vaccine problem, but it's also in many ways what the G20 is dealing with is the financial and social and economic crisis facing much of the world. And one of the topics we will be talking about today is both the increase, but also the increased visibility of the inequalities in the world. And we're also talking about accountability for the trillions of dollars that are flowing, and for what we call social protection, which is dealing with the most vulnerable, which means the poorest in every community, refugees, IDPs, internally displaced people, all the people who are so often forgotten, which brings us to the religious role, the G20 interfaith, which has, in our view, the primary responsibility of focusing on these issues of inequality, of contending with poverty, and contending with the protection of the most vulnerable, that they should never, never be forgotten. So those are, as we ask always, what's religion got to do with it? Why should the G20 be focused on the roles of religious institutions? It is this primary focus on both the moral imperative, but also the actual doing, because it is in many cases religious communities that have been taking the burden of the social protection. Our colleague Eric Leconte, who is with an organization called Jubilee USA, which is the successor of the Jubilee movement from the late 1990s and the early 2000s, around the turn of the millennium. He could not be here. There is a video event that we did with Eric, but in other settings, he has basically laid out what is the agenda of Jubilee USA with the G20 leaders, primarily the finance leaders, but with constant negotiations with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And I will very, very briefly, but if you're interested, all of this material is available. They have been with many religious institutions, including the Vatican, the COVID Commission of the Vatican, the Anglican Communion, and a number of other religious communities have been in intense negotiations for a year and a half about issues of debt, the debt standstill, starting to address some of the issues around patent on vaccines, but also some of the social protection and other financial flow issues. So there is a coalition that is working intensively on these issues that we will comment on here. His comment looking at the Bologna meeting was that the issues before October are very short-term and very urgent, and they still turn in some ways around debt, but more around financial mobilization for poor but also middle-income countries. That it is the role of China in the debt issue, but also the private sector. But it is also important that we turn to the next chapter, to the Indonesia presidency, where the issues will turn more around financial architecture and the question of reforms. In many ways, the reforms that did not take place after the 2008-2009 economic financial crisis, and yet the crises, the important issues that are still on the table. So our discussion today will flesh out some of these issues around inequality, accountability, social protection, both the short term and the long term. And they will also, I hope, probe the question of where the religious communities are involved and can be involved in these discussions.
Thanks, Catherine. Now we have the first speaker, Rajiv Bagawa, Director of the Parikh Institute of Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. Please, you have the floor. There, maybe there is better.
I can't see some people. I assume that they can't see me either, but I hope that would not obstruct our communication. So thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium and in particular to this session. The two central questions that we are asked to address are: how do we mobilize or develop theological teachings against rising inequalities. And the emphasis here is on theological teachings, and I'm going to focus on that. And second, how should we get religious leaders, not leaders in other fields, but religious leaders to become better advocates for justice and equality? These are from what I gathered from the little note that was sent to us, these are the two central questions. And these questions, of course, presuppose that these theological teachings already exist. At least they exist in some form. But that precisely is the problem in the case of Hinduism. And I speak of Hinduism because I was born into a Hindu family. And the problem is this, that as soon as you start talking about equality, you come at a massive stumbling block. Because arguably, while there are profound justifications for inequalities within Hinduism, there appear to be no moral justification for equality. There is a presumption in favor of inequality, and the burden of proof, therefore, is always on those who wish to treat individuals as groups or equals. So that's a problem. I mean, and that is a problem that has to be resolved before we can even begin to address some of the questions that have been put there. And the basis for this impression lies in the view that Hindu India is a preeminent example of Homo hierarchicus. This is a phrase that was used by the sociologist Louis Dumont, the French sociologist Louis Dumont. It is not equality, but hierarchy, which is the founding principle of Hindu theology and the organizational principle of Hindu society. In a hierarchical caste-ridden worldview, replete with graded inequalities, where each caste group sees itself as higher or lower than other groups, where groups lowest in hierarchy are treated as untouchables, and where even upper caste women find self-fulfillment only within a subordinate relationship or partnership with their husbands, there is no hope in hell for egalitarianism. To achieve equality, therefore, one must set aside Hinduism, or so it has been argued. And in fact, there was a lot of debate in India around this issue at the time of independence, when we were deliberating in the Constituent Assembly and formulating our constitution in between 1946 and 1950. And many of the people argued that there's no need for everything draw upon the resources of one's religion. One can just set those resources, they're non-existent, and therefore we can set religion aside in order to move forward. Okay. Now, obviously, actually not so obviously, but I find this view, this Homo hierarchicus view, a little oversimplistic. So to make my argument, I begin with an initial premise that all forms of equality, namely economic, political, social, all forms of equality rest on a prior claim of moral equality. Furthermore, to take my argument further, I distinguish two forms of moral equality. The first is intergroup, and the second is intragroup. So what do I mean by these? Intergroup equality is equality between members of groups with very different ideas of ethical self-realization. Say one that depends entirely on God and another that is completely independent of God, right? Despite deep differences in what counts as the highest good, God or no God, members of every ethical community should treat others with dignity and respect, perhaps even equal dignity and respect. Differences in soteriologies or deep ethics is not a ground for treating others with less dignity or respect. Okay, that's intergroup. The idea of intra-group equality is different. Here, people treat members of their own ethical community as equals, but not necessarily those with different salvific worldviews who they claim need not be treated as equals. So I shall retain, for present purposes, I should retain the term moral equality for the first, namely intergroup, and ethical equality for the second, namely intragroup. And with this framework in place, I now ask, how does Hinduism fare on the evaluative scale of equality? On moral equality, namely intergroup equality, in fact, it does pretty well. I would say that Hindu thought has been marked by a pluralist moral imaginary, where even an ethical perspective that deviates most from mainstream ideas of ethical self-fulfillment is believed to have some grasp of truth and therefore must be treated with respect. The most radically different perspective from one's own still has a claim to some degree of validity. In its best version, each perspective is believed to be an equally valid marga or way of reaching the ultimate, however that might be conceived. Now, if it is true that people who are morally equal deserve to be treated as equals, even in other domains, namely economic and political and so on, then there are sources in the Hindu tradition for satisfying the material needs of all, regardless of their religion, are pretty rich. What about intra-group equality or caste-related ideas of equality? Now, it's hard to justify caste hierarchies and its graded inequalities. How can all the privileges go to the upper caste and the harshest burdens be reserved for the low caste or the outcast? So Hinduism appears to fail badly on the standard of this form of moral equality. Yet even here, matters are a bit more complicated. For a start, Hinduism must be seen, as one of our sociologists, Trilokinath Madan, points out, as a federation of faiths. It is marked by deep internal plurality. A deep opposition to equality is found in one kind of literature, namely the Dharamshastric literature, in the period after the first century of the Common Era. But even these texts are not descriptive or representative. They are normative. That's what Brahmins are supposed to achieve, but they don't describe society, and they're certainly not representative, because there are a lot of texts. If you look at the epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the composition of the Bhakti saint poets, who are all Hindu, they have a much more complex understanding of what is the worth of equality. For instance, many texts acknowledge that even women and Shudras, namely the lower castes, desire the same ultimate goal. The starting premise of some of these texts is the ethical equality of individuals, regardless of caste and gender. In still others, knowledge is not the sole preserve of Brahmins. There are many forms of knowledge, and some of them are more in the hands and minds of low caste men and women, and Brahmins are required to learn from them. So this upsets the standard view of caste hierarchy that is found in the Dharamshastric literature, and that has been used to create this image of Homo hierarchicus. In short, egalitarian resources are available within the Hindu tradition in its literature and practice. Of course, they will not be in the same form as modern egalitarian thought. Yet, with suitable modification, this egalitarian can be constructed. Homo hierarchicus is a myth that contrasts well with modern notions of equality, but its own status in Hindu tradition is questionable. And so, if something like an egalitarian Hindu theology can be constructed, The question is, who will do it? Can it be accomplished by current religious leaders? And here, sadly, the answer is no. Most Hindu religious leaders appear to be hand in glove with big money and state power. I doubt if they have the willingness to address inequalities or to fight corruption. Worse, when the Muslim minority was blamed for spreading the coronavirus, this is something which has happened in many countries. The minorities have been blamed as carriers of the virus. And when they were stigmatized, not a single major Hindu leader condemned it. I could be wrong about this, but at least as far as I could tell. So clearly, this is a case where the educators need to be educated. Given that they exercise enormous influence over their followers, a word against unequal treatment of minorities would have gone a long way in repairing the damage. But alas, those critical words are still awaited. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Now, the floor is for Professor Antraud Hartmann, Professor of Development Economics at Johns Hopkins University in Bologna.
First of all, I have to confess that I feel quite intimidated being surrounded by religious leaders who can argue their point of view on morality and ethical norms. We economists are not very good at that. We like to hide behind figures and like to draw conclusions from that. But let me assure you that even we economists think inequality beyond a certain level is not good for societies, is not good for welfare. Highly unequal societies make it difficult to have inclusive growth, address poverty, provide services to vulnerable people. It leads to social tension, and its worst form, it leads to a state which is captured by a certain elite, which is not worried about the other side anymore. That being said, we should also recognize that over the last 20 years, progress has been made in terms of addressing inequality. Inter-country inequality in many countries has widened quite dramatically in some countries, including the country in advanced economies, including my own country in Germany. But we have seen a narrowing of incomes among countries. There has been so much growth in East Asia, particularly in China and India and other Asian countries, that we actually have seen a bit of a conversion. I will argue today that in fact, we are at the Kairos moment, as the two co-chairs said, because we are likely to see a reversal of that because of the COVID impact. And that is a crisis which very much might call for action and might provide the opportunity for action. And now let me just quickly turn to why I say we are likely going to see increasing inequalities. If I simply look at my economist self at numbers of economic growth, it is not so shocking for the developing world. The advanced economies declined by -8% of the GDP to 2020. Developing countries by -3%, Sub-Sahara by -1.8%. When we look into project prospects in 2021, advanced economies are likely to grow by 4.8%. Developing countries as a whole by 5.9%, but that's an illusion because it includes China and India, which are expected to grow at least reasonably well at 6.4% and 5.7%. And Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to grow at 3.4%. In principle, at first sight, not dramatic. However, if you look at the Sub-Saharan numbers and know that population growth rate is around 2.8%, then looking at a GDP growth of 3.4% means minimal per capita increase in Africa after a significant decline of around 4.8% in last year. Moreover, and that's more distressful, we are likely, when all we know so far, it's going to take some years before Africa can recapture the growth path it had prior to the pandemics. That means we're likely going to look at some very limited growth over the next 5 to 6 years. That's disconcerting. But more disconcerting is what we know on poverty. Poverty was a success story, poverty reduction, sorry, wrong language. The reduction of extreme poverty was one of the successes over the last 20 years. There was a significant reduction of extreme poverty based on $1.90 a day. Of course, again, very much because of successes in India and China. Africa was still in very high poverty levels, but even there we saw reductions. But all indications we have so far is that 2020, that trend is being reversed. We will likely expect an increase in poverty by 2% of the world population. That's a very significant increase of poverty. We don't have firm numbers yet, but all indications we have is that we're going to see the increase of extreme poor as shares of population, and then of course even more in absolute numbers because the world population is growing. Very disconcerting because that was one of the proud achievements under the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Even more disconcerting from my view is the story in hunger. About 3 months ago, we got the report on the state of hunger. Hunger has actually increased over the last 5 years already, but we expect in 2020 a massive increase of hunger, rising from about 150 million to 165 million. That's really disconcerting. Much of that, of course, is due to climate impacts on conflict. But the increase in 2020 is, of course, the impact of COVID-20 because people simply don't have the resources anymore. If you're very, very poor, it makes a difference if you just have that little bit more money to buy the nutritional needs. And all of us know how severe hunger is, particularly on young children under 3 years of age, that leads to irreversible impacts, cognitively, physically. So we're actually here laying the foundation for poverty and how the future it has intergenerational impacts. We don't really know yet the impacts on health outcomes, other of course than on COVID, whatever our COVID impacts. But it is likely, and we have country studies coming out, that in fact, so systems of providing maternal and replicative healthcare cannot be used as much anymore and provided for as much anymore. And we do run the risk of undoing much of what we have achieved over the last 20 years. Now, looking forward, what does it mean? What needs to be done? First of all, yes, access to vaccines. We need global actions on vaccine. That was already mentioned by the chairs. That is an urgent G20 agenda. Second, money. Keeping systems alive, health systems, social systems, building up nutritional services requires resources. It requires resources to the budget because many of these resources are public resources which need to be publicly funded. Now, quite a bit has been done already, and that's thanks to, the Jubilee and other groups and also the policymakers by the IMF, which did spring into action. That, however, being done, raises then also, but let me just put things in perspective, just to give you starking numbers. Advanced economies spent on average 28% of GDP in support in 2020. Developing countries as a whole, emerging countries spent 8% of GDP. Sub-Saharan Africa spent 2% of GDP. Now, I'm not saying that Africa should have spent 28% of GDP on its budget. It requires systems, but the differences are starking indeed. So sub-Saharan African countries must be resource starved to sustain the systems in the health, in the education, in the social systems. Okay, we need money. Of course, that raises the question of debt relief. Just imagine yourself, you have a house, you have a mortgage, the mortgage is getting bigger. That leaves little money for maintenance, that leaves little money for other activities. Social health, education, social services required reliable budgetary funds. If they're squeezed out by debt repayments, these funds are not available. So G20, yes, that question of debt relief in different forms is a key issue. And now let me talk a little bit at the end on health systems. Money is important, but we need systems to deliver it. And building systems which deliver health services, social service to all, not just to part of a society, in a reliable, trustworthy way, is a challenging agenda. We had huge difficulties with that before, we will continue to have it. It's much easier to build buildings, but to make sure that these health facilities are staffed by people, have the vaccines, provide the services they're expected to do, and not take bribes. And there, I think religious leaders also have a role to play. In faith-based organizations are very important providers of health services and social services. Faith-based institutions know who are the vulnerables in their groups, in their societies they serve, and thus can target to them. Faith-based leaders can also inspire trust into people to use these services, which they often don't want to use because they're treated badly or they don't trust them. So if we think social service and health services are important, faith-based leaders can help to make sure that they're also being used and trusted. And very importantly, now I come to the question of accountability. There are many ways today we can measure corruption. I'll give you only one example. With my students, I study household expenditure surveys. And as part of household expenditure surveys, we ask the family, how much money do you spend every month or every year on health services? And surprisingly, in many districts, it's very high, even so the services are expected to be public, free of charge. And they come out in certain places. So it's very clear that there's corruption being taken. And we have numerous instruments of evidence how one can actually measure corruption, much better than we had 10 years ago. But it's not enough to measure corruption. You have to do something about it. That means governments have to provide it, and the society has to demand it. You have to demand that the services are provided, to which you are entitled to. And that creates leadership. That requires leadership. And faith-based leaders can play a role because they're trusted and they can help that members of a society demand accountability. I would argue the technical instruments, we have a lot today, but it's not enough to have the techniques. The society needs to really fight for it. So yes, are we at a Kairos moment? Well, we are at a crisis. We are at a juncture where we will see increasing inequality. We are at a juncture where we will now miss a number of our SDGs, which 3 years ago we were still proud because we moved in the right direction. We as a world community adopted these sustainable development goals. It is time to stand up and say, now let's do something about it. And I just recall the famous HIPIC initiative of that work out of the 90s. I think, Catherine, I'm sure you were involved. I was involved in very different functions. That was a proud moment. It took a long time, but there was a dead risk, that work out. But the condition was you use the resources for certain purposes, like poverty alleviation, improved health services, improved education, improved social services in the least developed countries. And we could clearly say, as a result of that, there was significant progress, at least significant resource allocations. If today our focus is, yes, increase resource allocation, now our focus should be, in addition, get it to the right people in the right way. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Professor Jonathan Machado, Faculty of Law of the University of Coimbra. He will speak from here because he has slides to show us. Please. Can you open his mic?
Thank you, Deputy Stefano Fassina. Thank you, Catherine Marshall. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a great honor. I will share with you the work we have made in preparation of this topic as a group that was leading some webinars on corruption, the fight against corruption, and the role of religious communities. I would like to thank my assistant and friend Eduardo, who really was very important in doing all this. We tried to enter in contact with more than 80 institutions, religious institutions, to collect some information and feedback and cooperation with this project. But unfortunately, they seem not to be very interested in the corruption problem, and that is a problem. Sorry. This is okay. So corruption is the abuse of interested power for private gain. This is a topic, you know, these are the topics we covered. I will not develop, I will share it with you with some final remarks. As you know, corruption erodes trust, weakens democracy, hampers economic development, and further exacerbates inequality, tax evasion, poverty, social division, and environmental crisis. It encourages radicalism, populism, terrorism, and war. The recent events in Afghanistan, for instance, could be a case study. Those who are harmed most by corruption, often the poorest and unaffected countries, are most often members of a religious community. So the victims of corruption, most of them would be part of a religious community. Religious communities, preferably together, can and should do more to denounce and fight corruption and advocate for its victims. Ever since ancient times, corruption has been responsible for many deaths, violations of human rights and freedoms, and threats to the well-being of individuals and communities. The pandemic caused by COVID-19 has already affected hundreds of millions of people worldwide, spreading disease, death, suffering, and grief. When the pandemic began, previously existing corruption clearly limited the world's capacity to respond to the outbreak, namely by weakening healthcare delivery. The pandemic has also served as a catalyst for corruption, creating new opportunities to exploit weak oversight and inadequate transparency. All efforts to prevent and fight corruption are to be praised. United countries and individuals to build societies based on the primary values of human dignity, rule of law, democracy, justice, equality, and solidarity. Change must come not exclusively from above. It requires the contribution of each and every member of society. Civil society must demand the adoption of adequate and effective measures to promote and disseminate models of governance based on greater integrity, transparency, and accountability. Religious or faith-based communities and organizations can play an important role when it comes to preventing and fighting corruption. Religious communities are important in sharing ethical teachings to bolster effective action and making clear statements condemning these nefarious practices, reminding us that any illusion of fast and easy individual gain will only result in collective impoverishment. Pinpointing and documenting the daily corrosive effects of corruption, mobilizing communities in demanding public integrity, accountability, and transparency in their political and social spheres, serving as watchdogs to expose and denounce corrupt actors and practice, because silence and acquiescence can abet corrupt actors and practices, public and private. Some faith-based communities and organizations might be reticent to engage in anti-corruption efforts because their own organizations may not meet the highest standards of integrity. Constant action must be taken to purge this insidious plague from religious or faith-based organizations. Some faith-based communities concentrate their attention and efforts in approaching topics which are qualified as highly controversial and fractious, leaving anti-corruption challenges unattended and devolved to secular actors. Corruption will not be defeated only by legal means. Ethics, value, and morality must be part of the equation in strategic plans. We must support inter-religious research and dialogue projects like the G20 Interfaith that at an international level seek to address and understand the phenomenon of corruption in public and private sectors and certain recent epiphenomena such as corruption in politics, religion, financial sector, health or pharmaceutical industry, promoting a culture of legality and integrity. Our collective response to corruption, especially in times of pandemic crisis, will be more successful where channels of communication and cooperation between states, international organizations, and civil society, and particular religious or faith-based communities and organizations exist and are relied on in meaningful ways. We must promote and support the inclusion of religious or faith-based communities and organizations in the consultations, debates, roundtables, and forums of discussion that make part of the process to design implemented COVID-oriented programs, plans, and policies. So based on this, we try to develop some policy recommendations for the G20. These are just some examples. Put in place programs, plans, and policies designed to prevent and fight corruption in COVID-19 emergencies must be built upon upon an inclusive human rights approach to corruption and take a strong stand against inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. Take advantage of new technologies to prevent and fight corruption. Encourage civil society organizations to step up their efforts in preventing and fighting corruption, especially in the context of a pandemic crisis. Encourage faith-based communities and organizations to assume an active role as contributors for construction of a culture of righteousness based on unconditional respect for human dignity. Build solid political and legal frameworks which prioritize the protection of human dignity, rights and freedoms, democracy and the rule of law, the separation of powers and the institution of effective mechanisms of checks and balances, and the promotion of good government, trust, transparency, and accountability. Develop special responses and measures to prevent and punish corruption in the private sector. Special measures should be adopted in some key sectors. For example, in the case of health and big pharma, supply chain, service delivery, and administration of response to the health crisis, public procurement, namely emergency supplies and services, or the use of relief funds. As it was with BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, G20 should structure global programs and plans and policies designed to prevent and fight corruption, build upon an inclusive human rights approach to corruption, and take a strong stand against inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. Recognize that religious or faith-based communities and organizations can play a central role in showcasing and documenting the perverse effects of corruption in disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. Stimulate or deepen cooperation with religious or faith-based communities and organizations in the promotion of education and awareness-raising programs on core values shared in contemporary societies, many of which concern the individual and collective responsibility in building a fairer and sustainable world. Promote academic programs focused on teaching about religion and beliefs, their history, principles, values, contributions to society, can be a very helpful instrument to foster a culture of encounter, dialogue, and mutual respect between citizens and groups of divergent beliefs. Thank you. I just want to call your attention to a case that is now taking place in Mozambique concerning the hidden debts of Mozambique, which were debts assured by guaranteed by the state without the consent of the parliament. And now the poor, the poor citizenship of one of the poorest countries in the world is faced with a corrupt debt on its hands, and we can see the Bishop of Beira, for instance, the Catholic bishop, advocating against this terrible situation, which is an example of that which must not be done to poor people. So thank you for this moment. Thanks for hearing me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And now the last speaker, Brett Scharf, Director of the International Center for Law and Religious Studies, Science Auxilium. No, sorry, the Religious Studies. And then maybe we can open the floor for questions and intervention. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As others have, I'd like to echo my appreciation to the organizers of this event. I've had an unusually bird's eye view of what it has taken for Professor Catherine Marshall and Professor Cole Durham to organize this event in partnership with the local hosts, Alberto Maloney and their teams. Our center is active in planning and executing conferences. And in the more than 20 years that I've been working in this field, I think I can say with confidence that this is the most complex and challenging conference and environment of any of the events that we have been a part of. And so it is more than etiquette or formulaic to congratulate their teams and all of the people who have worked hard to make it possible for us to be here gathered in person for this event. So thank you very much, Catherine. I'm also grateful for the framing of today's discussion, a Kairos moment addressing inequalities. As Stefano Fassina explained at the beginning, Kairos is a Greek term that refers to a unique and unusual opportunity. And the unique and unusual opportunity with which we find ourselves faced is a result of the coronavirus crisis. And I believe it is a unique opportunity. I really liked Professor Marshall's framing of this with her students, of asking them to begin their thinking about the coronavirus crisis with a letter to their grandchildren. I think that's a sobering point of departure for each of us to think about. How have we risen to the challenge of this moment in our own places and in our own positions of opportunity for influence and of impact. And I also like the framing on the lens of inequality, because as difficult as the coronavirus has been for all of us, and I think it has been difficult for all of us, I think it's important for us to understand that the impacts have been unequal. Some have gotten relatively sick, some have gotten so sick that they have died. And we have seen this perhaps in our own circles of friends and family. In addition, it's quite clear that the economic impacts have been quite diverse. I really appreciated Professor Hartman's emphasis on the economic dimensions of the impact of COVID. In the United States, whether we look at income, whether we look at wealth, whether we look at unemployment, whether we look at health impacts, whether we look at even rates of vaccination, it's quite clear that those who were the most vulnerable to begin with, because they were old, because they had pre-existing conditions, or because they were in dangerous jobs or economically vulnerable, the impacts on those who least could afford the impacts of the coronavirus crisis have been highest. And I think it's fair to say that most of us are among the privileged. I have been talking to my students, and one thing I've been talking to them is how the coronavirus has affected us as law students and professors. The primary impact has been an inconvenience of not being able to gather in person for classes, but required to meet online. And this is difficult and it's stressful, but it's also an incredible privilege to be able to work safely from home or study safely from home while others don't have that luxury. And it's interesting to see how jarring it is to think about the privilege of quarantine rather than the hardship of quarantine. And I'm very grateful for the perspective that Rajiv brought to the importance of theological resources that need to be brought to bear on these issues, and to Ionatas's emphasis on corruption. This is perhaps one of the most thorny and difficult problems to root out of any culture. Once a culture becomes a culture of corruption, it exerts an enormous tax on all of us, not just an economic tax, but a social and spiritual tax as well. And finding roads out of cultures of corruption is much more difficult than finding roads into cultures of corruption. Now, as I have been thinking about this Kairos moment, I have been thinking about its most immediate challenge, which is vaccinating the world. There are many dimensions to this challenge: technical, financial, logistical, and ideological. But I believe that when we look back, when our grandchildren look back on this moment, that is going to be the challenge which we either rise to or fall short of. And as an academic, we like to make things as complicated as possible. And so I'm going to go against my every disposition as an academic and try to state this as simply and as straightforward as I can. And again, I'm indebted to Catherine Marshall for helping clarify my thinking on this issue. The G20 is an organization made up of the 20 largest economies on Earth, together with the entire European Union. And the G20 was created, or at least established its identity as a responder to crises. primarily the 2008 economic crisis. This is what I believe to be true. If this pandemic is going to be solved, it is going to be solved because of the successful collective effort of the G20 countries. And they will deserve credit for solving and addressing that problem. If this problem is not solved, if it is not adequately addressed, then I believe it will be and should be the G20 countries that bear the lion's share of the blame for that failure. There is no crisis that was more custom made for this forum than this crisis. And there are a lot of other important things to address, and there will be time and place to address them. But at this moment, this Kairos moment, we must address this public health, this world vaccination crisis in order for us to be able to move forward. That is as simply and as straightforwardly as I know how to state it. And if there is one thing that comes out of this meeting, I hope it is as clear a communication as we collectively are capable of mustering that this is true, that this is a problem that is the G20's problem. It is the problem of this Kairos moment, and it is the responsibility of the G20 countries to address it. Now, I want to add one other perspective on this, because I think it is actually a difficult problem to solve, not an easy problem to solve. For the last several years, I have been spending much of my time working on what we have come to call the Human Dignity Initiative, which is a perspective on human rights and a perspective on rejuvenating and renewing human rights that focuses on what the Punta del Este Declaration described as human dignity for everyone, everywhere. And I believe as we seek to solve this crisis, this is the proper lens through which the problem should be viewed. First of all, everyone. The challenge is to vaccinate the world, to vaccinate those from wealthy countries, middle income countries, and poor countries. And moreover, to vaccinate those in those categories within each country. Everyone is important. Everywhere is also important. The G20 countries, who's left out? Well, it's the 180 other countries that make up the United Nations. And so when we talk about the responsibility and the opportunity, the accountability, it is going to be, I think, largely those G20 countries that bear that accountability for solving this problem everywhere. And if we don't, this problem will not be solved. We will simply be 2 steps behind it as variants and new strains of the virus continue to present themselves. Perhaps some far more virulent and deadly than the variations that we have encountered so far. And human dignity. This is the primary lens through which I think this problem needs to be addressed, not only as we seek to reach everyone everywhere, but the manner in which we do it. This is a problem that coercive statism is unlikely to solve successfully. If this problem is going to be addressed, we need to meet people where they are in their humanity and in their complexity, with their fears and with their distrust, many of which fears and distrust are legitimate. We know, for example, that not all vaccines work equally well. We know that some of the vaccines have side effects. And if we are going to address the problem of vaccinating the world successfully, we can't simply try to shove it down the throats of an unwilling populace. We need to meet people where they are in their humanity and in their complexity. And the approaches that we take need to be persuasive. They need to be gentle. They need to seek to address the underlying fears and concerns that exist. And so even mandates can have exemptions. We've learned how to accommodate conscience. We've learned how to accommodate fear. We've learned how to accommodate distrust in many other areas of endeavor. And I think we need to seek to be respectful in this area as well. So I believe we are at a Kairos moment. I believe we are facing a unique generational crisis. And I think all of us will be judged on how we rise to the occasion that this crisis presents. As I've described it, I see twin imperatives. The first is to seek to vaccinate the world. Both the issues of accessibility and accountability that Stefano mentioned at the outset are very important. The second imperative is to do this in a way that is respectful of the human dignity of all people in all places. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Scharf. And now the floor is open for questions or intervention. We have about 15 minutes. So if you want to ask or make comments, you are very welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Javier Martinez Torron. I'm professor of law at Complutense University. I hear myself awkward. Can you hear me well, more or less? Okay, perhaps I should take it a little more distant. All of you mentioned the idea that the significance of the world of religious communities in fighting corruption. I'm not going to refer to the COVID-19 problem in particular, but I will refer to the, in the words of Catherine Marshall, the poorest and the most vulnerable members of society. And sometimes I have the impression that, and I can speak perhaps more about the Christian world, which is the one I know better. But sometimes I have the impression that when taking care of the poorest and the most vulnerable, the major Christian churches in different countries, they seem to get satisfied with providing directly or indirectly a fish from time to time to the poorest, instead of making sure that they are going to learn to fish by themselves. So they are not very often aware of the significant contribution they can provide to change the system in which they live. And very often what I see, I can see in some European countries, I can see it in Latin American countries, very often they, to some extent, probably not consciously, but they become to some extent accomplices of systems that are permeated by social injustice. So if they are the ones that should help to fight corruption, but at the same time, they have become inadvertently perhaps accomplices of the corrupted system, what's the way of breaking this vicious circle? Because the result is that part of the problem is that they get some sort of benefits from those not just states in order to keep their privileged status and so forth. And they say, okay, we could keep doing our job, but at the same time, they don't insist in the significance on changing the system. And if some members of those churches insist on that, they very often become politicized in the partisan meaning of the word.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Please.
Yes, good afternoon. In addition to the question of Dr. Martinez, what about countries where the fight against corruption it's also a political part, a partisan part, una lucha, a fight between political parties, and faith communities need to be neutral in the fight between political parties. Let me explain me a little more. You have situations, example Argentina. Argentina, we have a very, very strong, not conflict, but a very strong division between the party in the government against the main party in the opposition. If the faith community, we will say, we will show, look, the government make corruption, can to be for the public opinion that the faith community support the opposition against the government. Maybe in more strong democratic system, maybe here in Europe, the public opinion understands that the faith community are independent and don't have close link to some of both sides. But in very slow democracy, like in Latin America, the public opinion will see, oh, you are you support the government or you are against the government, and don't look the matter itself. Explain myself.
Thank you. Was clear. There are a couple other questions, and then maybe we can leave our panelists to answer.
Hello, sorry. My name is Michael Dreesen. I'm a professor at John Cabot University in Rome. And this is a question for Professor Bagawa. Thank you for your stimulating, as always, intervention. I work on the Muslim world, Muslim majority world, and I've become more sensitive to the ways in which oftentimes when we ask the Muslim world to become moderate or become liberal, we're asking them to be something that they're not. And I wanted to push you a little bit on the term equality itself and whether or not we over aggressively define equality on individualistic Western terms. And I was wondering if that was part of your attempt in this shift to intra versus intergroup equality. So bracket that. If I understand correctly, India is actually doing pretty well on some levels of equality. I mean, Gini coefficient, look, India for both the developing world and the developed world looks pretty good. It's higher than the United States, it's higher than Italy. And so I was wondering, you know, is that some hidden evidence of some back Hindu story which is pushing forward that intra-group equality, or are we undervaluing intra-group dynamics as a source of equality when we look just at individual levels of equality? Was that part of your story? I was wondering, you know, what you think about that or how you work that out.
Thank you. Then the last one on the other side. Oh, okay.
Hi everyone. Thank
Please,
you so much to all the
try
speakers.
to be short in the question,
Yes.
because we do not have much time.
Yes, my question is, Professor Bhargava mentioned that, you know, if you look at India, for example, the most popular or most influential religious leaders do not necessarily speak up on equality. And in forums like this, you know, the leaders at the highest levels across the world who are invited to platforms like this are usually those from those who are most privileged or elite within their own traditions, and not necessarily the grassroots progressive groups who may be trying to challenge inequality within their communities. So I just wanted to ask the panelists, what sort of ways can institutions like G20 empower those sort of voices within faith communities who are speaking out against inequality?
Thank you. The last two questions, one here and then the last one back.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wolfgang Danzberger with Princeton University Liechtenstein Institute. I found I was a bit delayed, but I found the presentations fascinating, but I wanted to echo an issue which has struck me a lot, both in Central Asia and in Afghanistan, meaning that our Western perspective of corruption is something which one can debate we are here in an EU country, and we know the power and force of the European Union's development assistance. And I will never forget the exchanges with Francesc Vendrell, chief of EU in Afghanistan, when there was discussion about corruption and the big term of relativity came up. Obviously, if you think about certain politics here, east and southeast from where we are, the notion of corruption begins ringing in a different way as well. So my question is, what does this mean? And as it was said before in one of the presentations, what does this mean in taking in cultural perspectives of the country, and as the lady has mentioned before, that make sure that all systems work and hunger and water can be combated. What does this mean with our dealing, obviously against resistance to deal with corruption, which we would otherwise find unacceptable? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question back there.
Hello, thank you all for your great remarks. My name is Samet Shabani and I'm from Skopje, North Macedonia. My question was a little bit general in a manner that here we are discussing about inequalities and the consequences of corruption as such. Many movements, or let's say radical groups that misuse religious values, are really using this moment of inequalities and corruption caused by public institutions or however in many countries. And they use this kind of narrative saying, you see, this is not, okay. And the main narratives goes like, you see secular institutions, they are doing a lot of inequalities, they are doing corruption, and this is why the solution is being back to this kind of whatever they want to promote as a radical narrative as such. On the other hand, in one of these sessions today in the morning, in the session of education and religious diversity, it was suggested that from the panelists, it was suggested that we should really consider putting religious values in very younger ages as possible to the child in order to save humankind, because there is a great sense of losing human values. In all of these kind of problems that we are also trying to address, for example, there was a great example by Mr. Brett Scarves in order with the vaccination, for example. We could see that many, for example, religious communities could help this process by coming out and saying, yes, we should be vaccinated, and this is, and so they use this authority in a proper and good manner to the population in order that they could be convinced in the let's say the beneficiaries of getting vaccinated. So in all of this, let's say nutshell, what is the roadmap out to get rid of inequalities and corruption? And to what extent you believe that religious has a very certain role on solving these global challenges? Thank you.
Thank you. I will leave the answer to Catherine Marshall and the speakers in the order they spoke before.
Well, these are all fascinating questions, and it's wonderful that we had a little bit of time to open up. I don't know, Ionatos, do you want to address the corruption issues? I will just say one thing I'm addressing my colleague Wolfgang here, that for a long time, it's not very long ago, that corruption was seen by many economists, not all economists, as basically natural and probably not very harmful. There are lots of academic papers on that and so on. And the view was maybe it was cultural, but the experience shows that that's balderdash, basically, that people do not like to have their money stolen from them. And I think the East Asia crisis made in 97, 99, made that starkly obvious, but that's a view. I think it is pretty close to a universal, that people don't like their government being inefficient, not protecting them, not providing services, etc. But on the more, the other, I mean, it is an interesting question, and Ionatos, maybe you can address it, that the G20 actually has had corruption as a central issue, working with Transparency International and others. It doesn't have very many tools except the will of the leaders, but it is so striking that both the extreme left and the extreme right both are grabbing on the issue of corruption in country after country as their justification for protests, toppling governments. I think Guinea, that's the reason, the most recent coup. I do think that there is a really powerful case for doing something about it. And as Arne said, we can measure corruption now. We know what's happening. So the challenge is to do something about it.
Thank you. Okay, maybe we can leave him answer, and then we can go back to the order we had.
Okay, I will probably comment on the several questions because they all point to very important topics. First of all, religious communities must address the problem of corruption with some soul searching, because, as you know, there was the Marxist critique that religion is the opium of the people, and this is based on the fact, on the historical fact that, as it was said, unfortunately, sometimes institutional religion was accomplished in institutional corruption. And that's why, for instance, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution were so anti-religious, because, you know, there was this unfortunate reality that, you know, the religious elite was a part of the elite, and there was this connection. And the incoherence of religion has been, and the corruption, for instance, has been denounced even by, for instance, Dante Alighieri in the Divine Comedy, criticizing the corruption of the church, of the hierarchy. So I think all religious communities, including the Protestants, as you know, Protestantism was a reaction against corruption in the Catholic Church, but unfortunately, we see lots of corruption also in the Protestant and evangelical spheres. So I think some soul searching is important before starting to speak about this problem. But religious communities must think that their credibility depends a lot on their position towards these issues. Like, for instance, debt relief, tax evasion, inequality, poverty, corruption. You know, they cannot just be in the side watching as these issues go along. And of course, there is a precedent in religion. You know, many religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islamism, and among others, have these positions against corruption. In Judaism, we see Moses and the prophets claiming against corruption and condemning corruption. And we see Jesus, for instance, expelling the traders from the temple because of the corruption in religion. In its encyclic Fratelli Tutti, the Pope has this image, a very interesting image, that, for instance, it's a good deed to help an old man to cross a river. But if a politician builds a bridge for the old man to cross the bridge, that's political love. You know, that's an act of political love. Even if the politician never met the old person directly, he is helping that person to cross the river with an act of political love. And so I think we all should strive for a world in which religious love, political love, legal love, economic love, and management love could be deeds, could lead to the systemic and structural changes that are needed. Because as it was said, sometimes, you know, just giving, you know, sometimes isolated acts of charity, as well-meaning as they can be and are most often, will not change the system. So that's why we need political love, legal love, institutional love, economic love to change the system.
Thanks. Please, Professor Bagawa. Please pay attention to the time.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I think I'll address your questions. Two questions I think you raised. One, I see the point in not imposing certain moral categories on people who are in some ways not willing to accept them. I mean, whether it is a particular understanding of freedom, which is associated with a liberal tradition, or, you know, equality, which is also associated with some kind of, you know, Western egalitarianism. But I honestly think that we must make a distinction between certain values and the way these values have been interpreted by some traditions in the West. And we mustn't think that that interpretation is the sole kind of repository of the value, right, in question. So I think that there is, I mean, the terms will be different, and the internal coloration will be different. If you look at it, if you unravel it some of these concepts, you'll find very interesting differences, but there would be a family resemblance. And I do think that there would be some conceptions, not of equality and liberty, but something which is part of the family, you'll find in other cultures. And there are always these little rebellions that are going on in the peoples of those cultures, which convey to you that they too are, not as different as we might like to believe if we thought in terms of incommensurability of cultures, radical difference between a Western culture and non-Western cultures, or Christian-based cultures and Islamic or Hindu cultures. I don't think there are bridges, moral bridges that can be discovered and that can be found, and we can build upon them. And so roughly that's the question that's the way that I would like to answer that question. On the second issue, I think a lot of the egalitarianism in India today is against traditional caste equalities, right? And so there is, if Hinduism, if the caste system is identified with Hinduism, then it is an anti-Hindu movement. And there is nothing wrong with it. I mean, everything about any particular worldview can't be correct. There are lots of things which need to be changed, and this may be one of them. But as I argued, I think that it would be mistaken to think that this is a worldview in which the idea of equality is simply not there. And I think there is a way in which you can argue that although this is, this is a lot of the egalitarianism is due to democratic aspirations over the last 100 years, intertwined with a certain kind of nationalism, because democracy came into India as nationalism, right? Which is not ethno-nationalism, but some other kind of nationalism, and that threw up a lot of churning in society, and a lot of what you see today, when you talked about the Gini coefficient, and I mean, a lot of that is because of this democratic upsurge. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see. I'm currently doing a project on democracy and morality in ancient Indian thought, which is for something called ethicos in America with Michael Walzer, and I'm looking at this literature and I find some very interesting things there. It's not going to be identical to the traditions in the West, but there would be some interesting resonances, and we'll see how it turns out. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Atman, please.
Two short points. One, to the question or to the remark, isn't it dangerous if faith-based institutions join into the fight against corruption, as we might get involved in politics, which might undermine us? I will argue corruption is not only fought in national programs and on aggregate levels. It is possible to fight corruption on local-based environments. And here we have today a lot of instruments which provide transparency of allocation of public resources. As part of, for example, development projects, which in my former life, when I was a senior official at the World Bank, we regularly put into education programs, public expenditure programs, where you have to actually make public budgets public. You have to break it down to the district, and which then shows so many schools are to be built, so many books are to be provided, so many teachers installed, and then it's a good idea to have a parent committee that somebody reads this and somebody asks for it. Or if there's a rural road and there's asphalt on it, and a year after that, the asphalt is sort of destroyed, very likely it's not the asphalt that one paid for, or procurement price it. I can go on and can go on. There are a lot of transparency instruments which are certainly required today by the donors and hopefully adopted, but they have to be put to use and they have to be called upon. That doesn't require you joining a political party and taking a stance. That requires helping the communities who live there understand these instruments and maybe empower them, help them to take actions to call for that. Those seems little, but they can be very powerful if they're really being pushed on. And I would argue we have actually on the local and regional level quite a few instruments, but they have to be demanded and empowered. Just last point, complementing what Catherine said. Why is corruption? People don't like it. We had a famous study in 2000. It's called Voices of the Poor, where one went around and just talked to people and said, what makes your life as a poor difficult? And to our surprise, and at that point, I was still a senior official at the World Bank, we heard corruption, because at any point in time, somebody can stand in my hut and say, pay me. I don't know when this will happen and how much it will be. That is horrifying for me, for the household. And it turned out to be a significant amount of the poorest household budget. So corruption is actually very burdensome, particularly for the poor.
Thanks. And then for the last answer, Professor Schartz.
I will respond to the last question and the first. With respect to the last question on the role of religious leaders and institutions, with respect to the vaccination need, I think there are two primary things. The first is persuasion, because sometimes religious leaders have a level of trust and credibility with their communities that is really important and valuable. And the second is in execution. Occasionally, the church parking lot is the best place for the vaccine clinic to be held in order for it to be accessible and attractive to religious communities. With respect to the first question, Javier, I think you focused my mind, because I think there are some problems that are fish problems and some problems that are fishing pole problems. And I think vaccinating the world is actually a fish problem. What we need to do is give everyone a fish, maybe 2 shots in the arm. But I think that isn't something that we need to expect other people to learn how to do. We don't need we might need new vaccines, but we don't need every person to be empowered to do that. What we need is to provide that and to persuade everyone to take advantage of getting those vaccines.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to my co-chair. Thank you to the panelists and all of you, especially the ones of you that make the comments and questions. I think we had a very nice and very interesting panel, and maybe we can summarize to the organizers the main points that came out of this panel. My feeling is that access to resources, financial resources, so debt relief, and the access to vaccine are key topics, and should be in the policy recommendations to the G20. But we can just provide inputs, then the organizer will decide how to address the issues. Thanks a lot, and good evening to all.